On a cold October evening in 2003, a bride walked into a lake house on the edge of a small Wisconsin town, wearing a dress her grandmother had sewn by hand. She never walked out of it. Police searched the water. They searched the woods. They searched every barn, every cellar, every abandoned hunting cabin within 20 miles. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the reception hall. No struggle, no blood, no note. Just a wedding dress, torn at the hem, found floating near the reeds at the edge of Miller's Lake 3 days later, and a bride who had simply ceased to exist. The case went cold within a year, cold within 5. By the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, most people in Cedar Falls had stopped saying her name out loud, as if speaking it might reopen a wound the town had spent a decade trying to close. 23 years later, an old woman cleaning out her late sister's estate found a photograph tucked inside a water-damaged family album. A photograph that shouldn't have existed, taken by someone who was never supposed to be there. What investigators uncovered next shocked everyone. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everybody waved from their porches and nobody locked their doors. Population just under 4,000. One high school. One diner that had been serving the same meatloaf special since 1978. A lake that froze thick enough to skate on by December and warmed just enough to swim in by July. Claire Bennett grew up 2 blocks from that lake, in a pale yellow house with a wraparound porch and a swing her father built the summer she turned 6. She was the kind of girl teachers remembered by name years after she'd graduated. Not because she caused trouble, but because she had a way of making people feel like the most interesting person in the room. She ran the yearbook committee. She sang in the church choir, off-key but louder than anyone else, because she said the point of singing wasn't to sound good. It was to feel something. By 26, Claire was working as a kindergarten teacher at the same elementary school she'd once attended, in a classroom 2 doors down from her old first-grade room. She still walked past her childhood house every morning on her way to work, waving at her mother through the kitchen window, the way she had since she was small enough to be carried on her father's shoulders. She had a younger sister, Rachel, 23, sharp-tongued and fiercely protective, who worked the front desk at the only hotel in town and dreamed, quietly, of leaving Cedar Falls for somewhere the horizon didn't end at a tree line. The 2 of them had been inseparable as children and had grown, as sisters sometimes do, into 2 very different women who still finished each other's sentences. Their parents, Tom and Linda Bennett, had been married 31 years. Tom ran the local hardware store. Linda taught piano lessons out of the living room 3 afternoons a week. They were, by every account, an ordinary family. The kind you'd walk past in a grocery store without a second glance. The kind whose ordinary lives were about to be shattered in a way no one could have predicted. Claire had met Daniel Reyes 4 years earlier when he moved to Cedar Falls to take over his uncle's contracting business. He was steady where she was spirited, quiet where she was loud, and their friends used to joke that opposites didn't just attract in their case. They orbited each other like something inevitable. Daniel proposed on the dock at Miller's Lake on a July evening, down on one knee in the wet grass, and Claire said yes before he'd even finished the question. Their wedding was set for the 2nd Saturday of October at Blackwood Manor, a converted lake house on the northern shore, all dark wood beams and wraparound windows that caught the sunset over the water. It was the kind of venue people in Cedar Falls saved for years to afford. Claire had dreamed about getting married there since she was a teenager, sneaking onto the property with Rachel to press their faces against the windows and imagine themselves inside. 200 guests were invited. Fairy lights were strung between the porch beams. The band, a 4-piece group that usually played at the county fair, learned 6 new songs just for the reception. Linda Bennett spent the morning of the wedding curling Claire's hair by hand, both of them crying and laughing in the same breath, the way mothers and daughters do on days that only happen once. The morning of October 11th, 2003, broke clear and cold over Cedar Falls, the first true frost of the season silvering the grass along the lakeshore. Guests would later describe the light that afternoon as almost cinematic. Low autumn sun slanting gold through the windows of Blackwood Manor, catching the dust motes stirred up by 200 pairs of dress shoes crossing the old wooden floors. The maple trees ringing the property had turned a deep, burnished red that week, as if the whole landscape had dressed for the occasion alongside the bride. Claire walked down the aisle at 4 in the afternoon on her father's arm, the hand-sewn dress catching the light with every step, and guests who were there still describe, even now, the particular quality of Tom Bennett's expression as he handed his daughter off at the altar. Pride and grief already tangled together, though none of them could have known yet how literally that grief was about to arrive. Daniel Reyes cried before she'd even reached him, unable to hold it back, and the sound of 200 people laughing gently at his tears became, for years afterward, one of the only warm memories anyone in Cedar Falls could bear to revisit. The reception spilled out onto the lawn as the sun went down, string lights flickering on one by one against a sky bruising slowly from orange to violet to a deep, starlit black. Smoke curled up from the fire pit. Somewhere past 10, Claire pulled off her heels entirely and danced barefoot across the cool grass with her father to a song the band hadn't rehearsed, improvising the last verse because Tom Bennett had requested it on the spot, and no one who witnessed it that night ever forgot the sound of her laughing through the mistakes. By every account from every person who was there, October 11th, 2003 was the happiest day of Claire Bennett's life. It was also the last day anyone would ever see her again. The reception ran late into the night. Guests remember the band playing until nearly 11. The smell of wood smoke from the fire pit out on the lawn. The sound of Claire's laughter carrying across the water as she danced barefoot on the dock with her father. Around 11:15 p.m., Claire told her sister Rachel she was going upstairs to change out of her gown before the send-off, complaining that the bodice was digging into her ribs after hours of dancing. Rachel offered to help her. Claire waved her off, laughing, telling her to go finish her wine and enjoy the party. It was the last conversation the two sisters would ever have. At 11:40, the wedding planner, a meticulous woman named Vivian Ashcroft, who had run Blackwood Manor's events for nearly a decade, knocked on the bridal suite door to let Claire know the sparklers were being handed out for the send-off. There was no answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. When she opened the door, the room was empty. Claire's overnight bag sat untouched on the bed. Her phone was still on the nightstand, 3 missed calls from her mother lighting up the screen. The window overlooking the lake was open, curtains lifting gently in the cold October air. At first, nobody panicked. Brides disappear from their own weddings all the time, for fresh air, for a private cry, for one last quiet moment before the send-off chaos. Daniel checked the bathroom. Rachel checked the gardens. Tom Bennett walked the length of the dock, calling his daughter's name into the dark, his voice growing smaller each time it came back to him unanswered. By midnight, the entire wedding party was searching the property with flashlights. By 1 a.m., Tom had called the police. The lake, by then, had gone black, and still, the fairy lights along the porch beams the only warmth left against a darkness that seemed, to more than one guest that night, to press in closer than it should have. Someone cut the band's power so the property would be quiet enough to hear a voice calling back. Someone else began knocking on the doors of every guest bedroom, then every bathroom, then every closet, the search growing more frantic and more absurd with each space it uncovered. Linda Bennett stood at the edge of the dock for nearly an hour, still in her mother-of-the-bride dress, calling her daughter's name into the dark until her voice broke, refusing every offer to go inside and warm up. Rachel searched the gardens twice, then a third time, checking behind the same hedges over and over as though repetition might change what she found there. Daniel Reyes waded waist-deep into the shallows near the dock, fully clothed, flashlight raised, some part of him refusing to believe the water could have taken her without leaving any sign at all. By sunrise, 200 wedding guests had become a search party combing the tree line around Blackwood Manor, and Claire Bennett had vanished as completely as if the October night had simply swallowed her whole. But investigators would soon discover that wasn't even the strangest part. The Cedar Falls Police Department had exactly 11 officers on payroll in October 2003, and none of them had ever worked a missing person case involving an adult who vanished without a trace. Within hours, the county sheriff's department and the state police were brought in, along with a K-9 search and rescue unit from 2 counties over. The dogs picked up Claire's scent at the bridal suite window and followed it roughly 40 feet toward the tree line, and then lost it entirely, as though she had stepped off the edge of the earth. No scent trail continued into the woods. No scent trail led toward the lake, the road, or any of the outbuildings on the property. It was as if she had been carried. Investigators canvassed every guest at the wedding. 200 interviews conducted over the following 6 weeks. Contradictions surfaced almost immediately. 3 separate guests swore they'd seen a car leaving the property around midnight with its headlights off, though none could agree on the make, model, or color. A groomsman admitted, reluctantly, that he'd seen Claire arguing with someone near the tree line earlier that evening, but couldn't identify who, claiming the fairy lights had washed out the figure's face. The caterer's assistant reported hearing a woman's raised voice from an upstairs window sometime after 11, though she couldn't be certain it belonged to the bride. Then there was the torn wedding dress. 3 days after the disappearance, a fisherman found it snagged in the reeds along the eastern edge of Miller's Lake, nearly a mile from Blackwood Manor. The hem was torn in a long, deliberate-looking line. There was no blood, no physical evidence of violence. Forensic testing in 2003 was limited compared to what exists today, and the dress yielded nothing conclusive. No foreign DNA, no fibers that could be traced to a specific location or person. Detective Ray Halloran, the lead investigator on the case, would later describe it as the strangest scene of his 30-year career. It was like she'd walked out of that dress and off the face of the earth, he told a local reporter in 2004. No evidence of a struggle, no evidence of anyone helping her leave. Just gone. Suspicion, as it often does, turned first toward the groom. Daniel Reyes had no alibi for the exact window of time Claire disappeared. He'd been outside near the fire pit with a group of groomsmen, and no one could pin down precisely when he'd last been seen among them. Investigators discovered Daniel had taken out a life insurance policy on Claire 2 months before the wedding, a detail that made front-page news in the county paper and turned the town against him almost overnight. Neighbors who had once waved to him on Main Street began crossing the street instead. Daniel maintained, through hours of police interviews, that the policy had been his uncle's idea. Standard practice, he said, for a newly married couple building a life together, no different from the policy he'd taken out on himself. Records eventually confirmed a matching policy existed in his name as well, benefiting Claire. Investigators found no financial motive, no history of violence, nothing beyond a grieving young husband whose wife had disappeared on the happiest night of his life. They cleared him. Publicly, quietly, without fanfare, the way small towns rarely forgive. Other names surfaced and faded. A groomsman with a minor assault charge from years earlier. A caterer who'd been fired from a previous job under murky circumstances. Even Claire's own father was quietly investigated after an old family friend mentioned, almost in passing, that Tom Bennett had once had a violent temper in his younger years. A lead that went nowhere, built on nothing but small-town memory and grief looking for somewhere to land. Every lead dissolved. Every witness contradicted the last. By the time the first snow fell on Cedar Falls that winter, Detective Halloran had a file 3 inches thick and not a single answer inside it. Divers spent 4 straight days combing the floor of Miller's Lake, working in wetsuits against water that had already dropped to a bone-aching 52 degrees, their flashlight beams cutting through silt clouds that swallowed visibility within arm's length. They found a rusted outboard motor, a child's bicycle that had been missing since 1997, and a wedding band that turned out, after a week of tension so thick the entire department held its breath, to belong to a fisherman who'd lost it 2 summers earlier. They did not find Claire. Search dogs were brought back a second time in November after an early snowfall, in case the cold had preserved a scent the October rain had washed away. They worked the tree line for 6 hours, noses to frost-hardened ground, and alerted, faintly, near an old logging road half a mile east of the property. A trail that dead-ended, infuriatingly, at a stretch of county road with no cameras, no witnesses, and no way to know whether a car had ever stopped there at all. Detective Halloran drove that logging road himself more times than he could count that winter, alone, at night, headlights cutting through bare branches, trying to see what he was missing. He would later admit to reporters that he'd started talking out loud to the empty road, asking it questions it never answered. The FBI was consulted in December, offering profiling assistance on a case that, by every measure they could apply, didn't fit a clean category. It wasn't a domestic homicide. There was no body, no physical evidence of violence beyond the torn dress. It wasn't a random abduction. Random abductions rarely happened with the kind of surgical precision this one had. No witnesses, no chaos, no mistakes. The profile they eventually produced described a perpetrator who likely had prior, intimate knowledge of the property and of Claire's habits. Someone who had planned, not improvised. At the time, no one in Cedar Falls could imagine who that person might be. Everyone Claire knew had an alibi, a history, a reason to be ruled out. The idea that a stranger from her earliest childhood, a boy she would not have remembered even in passing, might have been quietly watching her entire adult life simply never occurred to anyone, because it was, on its face, almost impossible to believe. That impossibility was exactly what allowed him to remain invisible for 15 years. The Bennett family refused to let the case die quietly. Linda Bennett kept Claire's bedroom exactly as it had been the morning of the wedding. The bed made, the closet full, a stuffed rabbit from childhood still propped against the pillow. Tom Bennett drove to the police station every single Monday for the first 2 years, asking Detective Holleran the same question in the same steady voice. Anything new? The answer was always no, and he always thanked him anyway, because Tom Bennett believed, with the kind of stubborn faith that either breaks a person or carries them, that giving up was its own kind of losing her twice. Rachel Bennett became something closer to an amateur investigator than a grieving sister. She built a private folder of newspaper clippings, police reports she requested under public records law, and handwritten timelines taped across her bedroom wall. She never forgave herself for letting Claire go upstairs alone that night, and the guilt calcified over the years into something that looked, to outsiders, almost like an obsession. Daniel Reyes never remarried. He sold the contracting business 7 years after the disappearance and moved 2 towns over, unable to walk past the lake without seeing his wife dancing barefoot on the dock in his memory. He kept Claire's wedding ring in a small wooden box on his nightstand for the rest of his life, though he could never quite explain to anyone, including himself, why. Every October, on the anniversary of the disappearance, the Bennetts placed a single candle in the front window of the pale yellow house. Neighbors began doing the same until the whole street glowed faintly gold every October 11th, a quiet, collective refusal to let the town forget. The town changed around that absence in small, accumulating ways. The kindergarten classroom Claire had taught in was given to a young teacher fresh out of college who found, tucked in the back of a supply closet, a shoebox of laminated name tags in Claire's looping handwriting and kept it on a shelf for years without ever quite being able to throw it away. Blackwood Manor lost bookings for 2 full seasons before a new owner rebranded it entirely, quietly removing the word wedding from its marketing for the better part of a decade. The diner on Main Street stopped serving a particular strawberry pie Claire had ordered at every birthday since she was 12, not out of any deliberate decision, but because the woman who used to bake it retired and no one thought to ask why the recipe mattered. Rachel Bennett tried, twice, to leave Cedar Falls the way she'd always dreamed of doing. Both times, she made it as far as a rental apartment in Minneapolis before turning around within the year, unable to shake the feeling that leaving meant giving up the one thing she'd promised herself she never would: the search. She took an online course in criminal justice, then another in forensic records analysis, filling 3 separate binders with her own private timeline of the case, cross-referenced by hand, updated obsessively every time a new detail surfaced in the local paper. Linda Bennett stopped teaching piano lessons the year her hands began shaking too badly to demonstrate the scales, though she never told anyone it was grief that caused it rather than age. She kept Claire's rabbit on the pillow. She kept the bedroom door open a crack every night, the way she had when Claire was small and afraid of the dark, though there was no longer anyone to hear it creak. Tom Bennett aged the way men do when they carry something too heavy for too long without ever setting it down. His hair going white within 3 years, his hands developing a faint tremor he blamed, unconvincingly, on the cold. He kept a photograph of Claire in his wallet, worn soft at the corners from being pulled out and shown to strangers who might, on any given Monday, remember something no one else had thought to ask. By the 10th anniversary, a local paper ran a retrospective titled Cedar Falls Unsolved Bride, a headline the Bennett family hated but never asked the paper to change, because at least it meant someone, somewhere, was still saying her name. If you're enjoying this investigation so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel continue bringing you stories like this. Now let's continue, because what investigators uncovered next was even more disturbing. For 13 years, the case sat in a storage room in the basement of the Cedar Falls Police Department, one banker's box among hundreds of others. Then, in 2016, a new detective named Priya Okafor was assigned to review a backlog of unsolved cases as part of a state-funded cold case initiative. She was young, meticulous, and had a habit of reading case files twice, once for the facts and once for what the facts didn't say. Something about Claire Bennett's file bothered her immediately. The canine scent trail stopped dead 40 feet from the bridal suite, the torn dress with no blood, the contradictory sightings of a car with its headlights off. It read less like a crime of passion and more like something planned, something rehearsed. Okafor requested that the physical evidence be resubmitted for modern forensic testing, a technology that hadn't existed in 2003. The torn wedding dress, still preserved in an evidence locker, was sent to the state crime lab for advanced trace DNA analysis. It took 8 months. When the results came back, they revealed a single, unidentified male DNA profile on the interior seam of the dress. Not Daniel Reyes, not anyone in the original suspect pool. A stranger. The DNA didn't match anyone in the National Criminal Database. It was a dead end wrapped in new technology, and for a while, it seemed the case would go cold all over again. Okafor didn't let it rest there. She spent her evenings, off the clock, rereading witness statements from 2003 with a highlighter in hand, circling small inconsistencies no one had ever chased down. The caterer's assistant who'd heard a raised voice from an upstairs window, a detail that had been noted and never followed up on. The groomsman who claimed he'd seen Claire arguing with someone near the tree line, whose statement had been dismissed at the time as unreliable because he'd been drinking. She tracked that groomsman down in 2017, 14 years older and long since moved away, and sat with him in his kitchen while he strained to remember a face he'd only glimpsed once, in bad light, at the edge of his vision, half a lifetime ago. He couldn't give her a name. But he remembered one detail that hadn't made it into the original report. The man he'd seen had been carrying a camera. It was a small thing. It might have meant nothing. Dozens of guests had cameras that night, back before smartphones made photographers of everyone. But Okafor logged it anyway, in the growing file of details that didn't fit anywhere yet, the way a puzzle piece sits at the edge of a table until, months later, the picture around it finally makes sense of its shape. She requested the original vendor list from Blackwood Manor twice before finding it. The venue had changed ownership in 2011, and most of the old paperwork had been boxed and forgotten in a storage unit the new owners barely remembered existed. When it finally surfaced, water-stained and half illegible, it would become, though no one knew it yet, the single most important document in the entire case. Then, in the spring of 2018, an elderly woman named Dorothy Kessler passed away in a nursing home 2 counties over, and her niece began the long, tedious process of clearing out the family's old lake cottage. A modest property that had sat mostly empty for over a decade, tucked into a quiet stretch of forest along the northern edge of Miller's Lake, less than 2 miles from Blackwood Manor. Inside a water-damaged photo album in the attic, the niece found something strange. A photograph of Claire and Daniel's wedding, taken from a distance, through the trees, showing the reception in full swing on the night of October 11th, 2003. A night Dorothy Kessler had never been invited to, in a family with no connection to either the Bennetts or the Reyeses. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, someone had written a single word. Finally. The niece, unsettled, brought the photograph to the Cedar Falls Police Department. It landed on Detective Okafor's desk 3 days later. One tiny overlooked clue reopened everything. Okafor pulled county property records for the Kessler cottage and found something that made her sit back in her chair. The property hadn't belonged to Dorothy Kessler at all in 2003. It had been purchased that year by a corporation registered under a name that led, after weeks of tracing shell filings, back to Dorothy's nephew, a man named Tobias Kessler. Nobody in Cedar Falls remembered the name. He didn't appear anywhere in the original 2003 investigation. Not in the guest list, not in the witness interviews, not in a single police report from 13 years of dead ends. It was as if he had never existed in Claire Bennett's world at all. But he had. Digging through old Cedar Falls elementary school records, Records Okafor requested on a hunch after noticing Dorothy Kessler's address once fell within the school's district lines. She found a class roster from 1985. A quiet boy named Tobias Kessler had shared a first-grade classroom with a 5-year-old Claire Bennett for exactly one school year before his family abruptly relocated out of state. He was the suspect no one had ever considered because no one had ever known he existed in her life at all. But investigators would soon discover this wasn't just a childhood classmate with an unsettling photograph. It was only the beginning. The investigation, once reopened, expanded faster than anyone anticipated. Okafor built a small task force, pulling in Detective Halloran, retired now, but unwilling to let the case go unsolved, along with forensic genealogists, digital forensic specialists, and a records analyst who spent weeks tracing Tobias Kessler's movements across 3 decades. What emerged was the profile of a man who had spent most of his adult life quietly, meticulously orbiting Claire Bennett's world without ever once entering it directly. School records showed Tobias's family moved to Ohio the summer after first grade, following his father's job transfer. But a search of old newspaper archives turned up something unexpected. A photograph from a 1996 Cedar Falls County Fair, printed in the local paper, showing a crowd of teenagers at a carnival booth. In the blurred background, barely visible, stood a boy investigators would later confirm. Through age progression software and a surviving yearbook photo from his brief time at Cedar Falls Elementary, was almost certainly a teenage Tobias Kessler. He had come back, quietly and more than once. Digital forensics uncovered an old, long-dormant account on an early 2000s internet forum for amateur photographers, registered under a username that matched an email address eventually linked to Tobias. Posts spanning nearly 2 years showed him discussing techniques for photographing people without them noticing, alongside several photographs. Landscapes, mostly, but 2 included a young woman in the far distance who investigators identified as Claire, taken during her college years at a state university nearly 90 miles from Cedar Falls. He had followed her there, too. Financial records showed Tobias Kessler had worked under a name investigators eventually connected to a forged set of identification documents as a freelance photographer for several small Wisconsin wedding venues throughout the early 2000s, including, for exactly 1 season, Blackwood Manor. He hadn't just attended Claire's wedding from the shadows. He had worked it. Okafor brought in a forensic genealogist to help trace the sprawling, tangled web of names Tobias Kessler had used over the years, a technique that had only recently become standard practice in cold cases, built on the same public genetic databases ordinary people use to find long-lost relatives. Comparing the unidentified male DNA profile from the torn wedding dress against distant genetic matches uploaded to a public genealogy site, the genealogist built out a family tree spanning 4 generations, narrowing an initial pool of several hundred possible relatives down to a single small branch, the Kessler family of rural Wisconsin and, later, Ohio. It was slow, careful work, cross-referencing birth records, obituaries, old church directories, and a handful of yearbook photographs digitized by a local historical society years earlier, almost by accident. Every new document added one more thread to a portrait of a man who had spent 30 years building an entire second life in the negative space around Claire Bennett's, present at the edges of nearly every major chapter of it, never once close enough to be noticed. A search of decommissioned newspaper archive microfilm, digitized only in 2015 as part of a state library grant, turned up a wedding photography advertisement from a defunct county classified section, dated the spring before Claire's wedding, listing services under the name Tom Kelly Photography, with a phone number that traced, through old telecom records the task force had to petition a judge, to unseal, back to a prepaid account registered under yet another alias. The suspect isn't who everyone believed. And this was only the first of the lies about to unravel. Vivian Ashcroft, the wedding planner who had discovered the empty bridal suite in 2003, was still living in Cedar Falls in 2018, retired now, running a small flower shop on Main Street. When Detective Okafor showed her a photograph of Tobias Kessler, pulled from decades-old employment records, Vivian went very quiet. She recognized him. Not as Tobias Kessler, but as a freelance photographer named Tom Kelly, hired for a handful of events at Blackwood Manor that season, including, she now remembered with a slow, dawning horror, Claire and Daniel's wedding. She had never mentioned him to the police in 2003, she explained, because photographers came and went constantly, and no one had ever asked her about the vendors. Only the guests. It was a detail that had sat in her memory for 15 years, unexamined, simply because no one had known the right question to ask. Okafor pulled the original vendor contracts from Blackwood Manor's archived records, water-stained but intact, and found a signature at the bottom of a freelance photography agreement, Tom Kelly. The forwarding address listed matched, almost exactly, a rural route number 2 miles from the Kessler cottage. Tom Kelly had never been paid. Vivian recalled, once the memory fully surfaced, that the photographer never submitted an invoice, never followed up, and never delivered a single photograph from the event. At the time, she'd assumed he simply hadn't shown up. Now, it was clear he had shown up. He simply hadn't left the way anyone expected. As the task force re-interviewed everyone still living who had any connection to the wedding, old wounds and small, unrelated secrets surfaced alongside the real ones, each briefly threatening to derail the investigation before being ruled out. A groomsman confessed, red-faced and 30 pounds heavier than he'd been in 2003, that the reason he'd been vague about his whereabouts that night was an affair with a bridesmaid, nothing more, a secret he'd guarded for 15 years out of nothing but shame. A former Blackwood Manor employee turned out to have been quietly skimming cash from the venue's bar tabs that entire wedding season, a detail he'd hidden from police in 2003 for fear of losing his job, unrelated to Claire's disappearance, but enough to eat up 2 full days of investigator time before it was cleared. Even Daniel Reyes was pulled back into the case one more time, asked to account, once again, for a life insurance policy that had haunted him for 15 years, though this time the questioning felt different. Less an accusation than a formality, a box that needed checking before the real story could move forward. He answered every question the same way he had in 2003, patient and hollowed out, a man who had spent a decade and a half being suspected of a crime against the person he loved most, only to learn, at last, that the truth had been hiding somewhere he never could have looked. Every one of these threads, in the end, led nowhere near the truth. And that, investigators would later reflect, was precisely why Tobias Kessler had gone undetected for so long. In a town small enough that everyone had secrets, it was easy for the one secret that mattered to hide in plain sight among all the smaller, more ordinary ones. Someone lied. Someone hid evidence. Someone had built an entire false identity, one photography job at a time, to stand 50 feet from Claire Bennett on the most important night of her life without anyone in her world ever knowing his real name. But someone was still watching. As the task force widened its search, it discovered something that turned the investigation from a decades-old mystery into an active, urgent case. Tobias Kessler's last confirmed address. A small rental apartment 2 states away under his real name. Had been vacated abruptly in 2015, 3 years before Dorothy Kessler's niece found the photograph in the attic. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, a man who kept his blinds drawn and rarely spoke beyond a nod in the hallway. His employer, a mid-sized printing company, confirmed he'd resigned without notice, leaving behind a locker containing nothing but a stack of old newspaper clippings. Every one of them about Claire Bennett's disappearance, spanning from 2003 to as recently as 2014, along with a handwritten notebook filled with dates, addresses, and observations investigators would later describe as a surveillance log. The final entry, dated 3 days before he vanished from that apartment, read simply, "Time to go home." Forensic accountants traced a small, careful pattern of cash withdrawals in the weeks before his disappearance, along with a single wire transfer to a hardware store in a town neighboring Cedar Falls. A purchase, investigators would later confirm, for reinforced steel shelving and a commercial-grade dehumidifier. Everything pointed back to the Kessler cottage. One photograph exposed a terrifying truth. Tobias Kessler hadn't simply obsessed over a memory for 30 years. He had, at some point, returned to Cedar Falls. And investigators were no longer looking for a killer from 2003. They were looking for a man who might still, somehow, impossibly, have someone with him. The property records told a story investigators hadn't considered until Okafor cross-referenced building permits filed under the Shell Corporation linked to Tobias Kessler. In 2004, 6 months after Claire's disappearance, A permit had been filed for structural repairs to the Kessler cottage's foundation. No inspector had ever followed up. Small-town permit offices, understaffed and trusting, rarely did. When investigators finally obtained a search warrant for the cottage in the fall of 2018, they found it exactly as Dorothy Kessler had left it years earlier. Dust-covered furniture, yellowed curtains, the quiet decay of a house that had sat empty for a long time. On the surface, there was nothing. It was a K-9 unit, brought in for the search, that alerted near a false wall in the basement, behind a bank of old shelving units bolted unusually deep into the concrete. Behind that wall, investigators found a narrow staircase leading down to a second, hidden basement level, one that did not appear on any of the cottage's original architectural blueprints. Reinforced walls. A single reinforced door with a heavy external bolt lock. A small room beyond it, no larger than a child's bedroom, containing a cot, a portable heater, a stack of books, and a wall covered. Every inch of it, in photographs of Claire Bennett spanning more than a decade. But the room was empty. The air inside still smelled faintly of vanilla. A specific, particular vanilla, investigators would later learn, that matched a candle scent Claire had used in her childhood bedroom. One Linda Bennett confirmed her daughter had carried with her into adulthood as a small, comforting ritual. Someone had been kept in that room, recently enough that the scent hadn't faded. Forensic technicians processed the hidden room for nearly a full day, photographing every inch before removing a single item. The books stacked against the wall were children's titles from the early 2000s, the kind Claire might have once read to her kindergarten class, alongside a handful of adult novels with cracked spines, read and reread so many times the pages had gone soft. A small mirror hung crooked above the cot. A calendar from 2017 was tacked to the wall, most of its days marked with small, unreadable symbols in pencil. A private shorthand investigators would later come to believe was Claire's own attempt to track the passage of time in a place with no windows and no natural light. Digital forensics recovered a single hard drive from a laptop found upstairs, heavily encrypted, that took the FBI's cybercrime unit nearly 3 weeks to breach. Inside were thousands of photographs spanning 3 decades. Claire as a child on a playground, Claire at her college graduation, Claire and Daniel's engagement announcement clipped from the local paper, Claire's kindergarten classroom photographed through a chain-link fence from across the street. Folder after folder, meticulously organized by year, forming a complete, obsessive visual record of a life Tobias Kessler had never been part of, and had apparently decided, at some point no one could pinpoint exactly, that he was owed anyway. The final folder, dated 2003, contained the wedding photographs he had taken as Tom Kelly. Dozens of them, technically excellent, warm and golden in the fairy-like glow of the reception. Claire laughing. Claire is dancing barefoot with her father. Claire looked, in every frame, entirely unaware that the man behind the camera had already decided the night would not end the way everyone around her believed it would. It wasn't over. The discovery made national news within 48 hours. Cedar Falls, a town of fewer than 4,000 people, found itself at the center of a story that reporters from 3 networks descended on within a single week. Detective Okafor, working with state police and the FBI's violent crime unit, issued an urgent alert for Tobias Kessler, now 51 years old, along with an age-progressed image generated from his last confirmed photograph. Cell tower data from a burner phone linked to a prepaid account, traced through the same wire transfer pattern investigators had already flagged, placed him somewhere in a rural stretch of northern Minnesota as recently as 4 days before the search warrant was executed. It was, investigators believed, the closest they had come to Claire Bennett in 15 years. And then, in a break that came from an entirely unexpected direction, a woman working the night shift at a rural gas station 300 miles north of Cedar Falls called local police after a customer paid for gas in cash and refused to make eye contact. A man matching the age-progressed image almost exactly, driving a pickup truck registered under yet another false identity. Local police pulled the truck over 11 miles down the highway. Tobias Kessler was alone in the vehicle. He was arrested without incident. But the truck bed, investigators found, contained supplies for what appeared to be an extended stay somewhere remote. camping equipment, a second reinforced lock mechanism still in its original packaging, and a hand-drawn map of a hunting property in the Boundary Waters Wilderness area, owned, records would soon reveal, by yet another shell company traced back to Dorothy Kessler's estate. Claire Bennett was not with him. The truck's GPS unit, seized and analyzed within hours, revealed a route that had originated 3 days earlier, not from the Kessler cottage in Wisconsin, but from a remote property nearly 200 miles north. A coordinate that matched nothing in any existing property database the task force had already searched. It took a records specialist working through the night to trace it. An unregistered parcel of land inside the Boundary Waters Wilderness area, technically part of a decommissioned logging concession that had reverted to informal, undocumented private use decades earlier, the kind of land so remote and so poorly mapped that no shell corporation search had ever been able to surface it. Investigators believed, based on the timeline of the GPS data and the fresh camping supplies found in the truck bed, that Tobias Kessler had moved Claire to this new location only days before his arrest. Likely, they theorized, in a state of escalating paranoia after learning, somehow, that his aunt's estate was being cleared out and the old photograph might surface. It was a chilling realization. The same estate sale that had finally cracked the case open had also very nearly caused him to disappear, with Claire permanently into land, so remote it might never have been searched at all. Every hour mattered now in a way it hadn't in 15 years. Search and rescue coordinators pulled in resources from 3 states, working against a forecast that predicted the season's first hard freeze within 72 hours. Conditions that, if Claire was being kept somewhere without adequate heat, could turn survivable into fatal with terrifying speed. Claire Bennett was not with him, but she was. They now believed with a certainty that made the entire task force move faster than they ever had, still alive somewhere, and running out of time. The interrogation of Tobias Kessler stretched over 11 hours. For the first 6, he said nothing beyond his name. It was Detective Halloran, retired but asked back for this single interview because of a working theory that Tobias might respond to the same investigator who'd once, unknowingly, walked past him at Claire's wedding in 2003. Who finally got him talking. Halloran didn't push. He simply set the photograph on the table, the one from Dorothy Kessler's attic, and asked a single question. Why finally? Something in Tobias Kessler seemed to give way. He talked, slowly and without apparent remorse, about a boy who had loved a little girl in a first-grade classroom in a way he never had the language to name, and who had spent the next 3 decades unable to let go of a version of Cedar Falls that no longer existed. He described returning as a teenager, watching from a distance. He described building a career, a life, an entire second identity, all of it in quiet orbit around a woman who had no idea he existed. He described the wedding night in chilling, methodical detail. How he'd used his access as the event photographer to slip Claire a sedative in a glass of water he'd offered her outside the bridal suite, telling her it was from her mother. How he'd carried her through a side door and down to a rowboat he'd hidden along the shoreline earlier that week, how he'd torn the hem of her dress himself and let it drift into the reeds a mile downstream to send searchers in the wrong direction, how the canine trail had stopped at 40 feet because that was exactly where he had lifted her off the ground. He described 15 years of moving her between 3 different hidden locations: the Kessler cottage, a second property in Minnesota, and briefly, terrifyingly, an underground storm shelter on a rented farm property in Iowa. Always one step ahead of a search that never once knew to look for him at all. He spoke, at one point, about the years he'd spent watching Claire's ordinary life from just outside its edges. Sitting in the back pew during a Christmas Eve service he had no business attending, standing across the street from the elementary school during recess, close enough to hear children's laughter carry across the playground, but never close enough to be seen. He described these moments not with shame, investigators noted, but with something closer to nostalgia, as though recounting a courtship rather than a decades-long campaign of surveillance. He grew agitated only once during the 11 hours, when Halloran asked him directly whether he understood that Claire had a life of her own, a family, a husband, a classroom full of 5-year-olds who needed her. Tobias Kessler's answer, delivered flatly, chilled everyone in the room. He said he had given her a better life than the one she would have had, a life devoted entirely and without distraction to being loved. He did not appear to understand, even after 11 hours of questioning, why anyone would see it differently. He would not say, even after 11 hours, where she was now. But someone was still watching, and this time, it wasn't him. Detective Okafor had already begun tracing the hand-drawn map found in his truck, and a second team was already moving toward the boundary waters. Massive revelation followed massive revelation over the next 72 hours, each one reframing everything the town of Cedar Falls thought it understood about that October night in 2003. The single word written on the back of the photograph, finally, took on new, horrifying weight. Tobias Kessler hadn't simply captured a wedding from a distance. He had spent years believing in a delusion that investigators consulting psychologist would later describe as a deeply entrenched erotomanic fixation, that Claire had always belonged to him, and that the wedding was not a loss to be mourned, but an obstacle, finally, to be removed. The hidden relationships buried inside the case went deeper than anyone anticipated. Records showed Tobias Kessler's aunt, Dorothy, had known, at least in the final years of her life. A handwritten letter found among her belongings, dated 2014, pleaded with her nephew to let the girl go before it's too late. Language that suggested Dorothy had visited the property, had seen something, and had chosen, out of some tangled mixture of love and fear, to protect her nephew's secret rather than report it. She died, never having told anyone. Old crimes connected in ways that shook the task force further. A cold case from a neighboring county. A young woman named Beth Ann Cooper, who vanished from a Minnesota state fair in 2009 and was never found, bore chilling similarities to Claire's case. A rural property nearby registered under yet another shell corporation, a canine trail that stopped abruptly, a torn piece of clothing found downstream from where she vanished. Investigators began to fear Claire Bennett might not have been the only woman Tobias Kessler had ever taken. Everything the town believed about a single tragic night in 2003 had been wrong. It hadn't been one impulsive act by a jealous groom, or a random stranger's violence, or a tragic accident swallowed by the lake. It had been the culmination of 30 years of quiet, patient, meticulously hidden obsession. And it was still, as the search teams moved through dense Minnesota wilderness on a cold October morning 15 years later, not yet over. The Boundary Waters search took 2 days. The hand-drawn map led investigators to a remote hunting cabin nearly 11 miles from the nearest access road, accessible only by a narrow logging trail that had clearly gone unused by anyone but Tobias Kessler for years. Search teams moved in on foot, with K-9 units and a state police tactical unit, as a light snow began to fall across the wilderness. The same kind of cold, quiet October morning that had swallowed Claire Bennett whole 15 years earlier. They found the cabin just after 2 p.m. on the second day. It was smaller than the Kessler cottage's hidden room, more crudely built, clearly a fallback location constructed in haste sometime after the original hiding place had begun to feel, to Tobias Kessler, too close to discovery. A single door. A single reinforced lock. And behind it, in a space barely large enough to stand in, weak from years of isolation but alive, was a woman investigators would confirm through DNA testing within 48 hours was Claire Bennett, 41 years old, 15 years older than the 26-year-old bride who had vanished from Blackwood Manor. Thin, disoriented, blinking against daylight, she had not felt on her skin in longer than she could clearly remember, but alive. She was airlifted to a hospital in Duluth. The first phone call made from that hospital room, before anything else, before news crews, before statements, before anything the world would eventually need to know, was to a pale yellow house 2 blocks from Miller's Lake, where Tom and Linda Bennett had kept a single candle burning in the front window every October for 15 years. Linda Bennett would later describe picking up the phone and hearing a voice she recognized instantly, impossibly, saying 4 words she had stopped believing she would ever hear again. "Mom, it's me." Claire's account, given carefully over the following weeks as she began the long, uncertain process of physical and psychological recovery, filled in the last of what investigators hadn't been able to reconstruct from evidence alone. She remembered almost nothing of the wedding night itself beyond the taste of the water Tobias had offered her outside the bridal suite, and waking, Hours later, disoriented and terrified, in a room she didn't recognize, to a man she vaguely remembered from a childhood classroom 30 years earlier, calmly explaining that she was safe now, that she was finally home, that everything that came before had simply been a life she was never meant to have. She described years of moving between locations whenever Tobias grew anxious that someone might be getting close. Years of small, desperate acts of resistance met with increasingly rigid control, years of clinging to fragments of the life she'd lost, reciting her students' names to herself in the dark so she wouldn't forget who she had been. She had not known, in all that time, that a photograph existed. She had not known her family had never stopped looking. She had not known until a nurse in Duluth gently told her that her father had walked into the police station every single Monday for 15 years, asking the same question, refusing to let her go. A trauma psychologist who worked with Claire in the weeks following her rescue described what she'd experienced not as a single, static captivity, but as a slow, engineered erosion of her sense of self. Tobias Kessler had, over the years, taken away her name in small increments, insisting at first on pet names, then on a new name entirely, testing, always testing, how much of Claire Bennett could be, quietly dismantled before there was nothing left to resist with. She had fought back in the only ways available to her, memorizing her students' names in the dark, humming the hymns from her church choir under her breath until the tune wore a groove into her memory she refused to let him erase, tracing, with her fingernail, the outline of the yellow house she'd grown up in onto the wall beside her cot, over and over until the shape was worn faint into the paint. She described, too, small moments of Tobias Kessler's own unraveling. Nights he wept without explanation, days he wouldn't speak at all, a growing paranoia in the final years that made him move her with increasing frequency, dismantling and rebuilding his careful world each time he became convinced someone was closing in. She had not known, until investigators later confirmed it for her, how close that paranoia had come to being justified. How many times, across 15 years, the truth had brushed against discovery and slipped away again by inches. What she remembered most clearly, she said, in the one interview she agreed to give, was not fear, though there had been plenty of that. It was the stubborn, quiet certainty, carried through 15 winters in rooms without windows, that somewhere beyond whatever walls she was behind, her mother was still leaving a light on for her. She said she didn't know how she knew that. She just always had. Show justice, or the lack of it, investigators would say later, was complicated in this case. Tobias Kessler was charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and a growing list of related offenses spanning 3 states, along with renewed scrutiny in the still unsolved disappearance of Beth Ann Cooper. A case that, as of this telling, remains under active investigation. He is currently awaiting trial, having offered no further statement since his arrest beyond the confession given in that first 11-hour interview. Claire Bennett, after 15 years, came home. Cedar Falls held a small gathering the following spring. Not a celebration, exactly, because there was too much lost time for that word to feel honest, but something closer to a quiet exhale the whole town had been holding since 2003. Rachel Bennett, 38 now, sat with her sister on the same dock where Daniel Reyes had once proposed, the two of them talking in the easy, overlapping way sisters do, as though 15 years hadn't carved a canyon between one conversation and the next. Rachel had carried a guilt for a decade and a half over letting Claire go upstairs alone that night, a guilt Claire, gently and without hesitation, told her sister she never needed to carry at all. Daniel Reyes visited once, quietly, without cameras. What passed between them in that conversation has never been made public, and Claire has asked, in the one interview she has given since her return, that it remain that way. She said only that some things belong to the people who lived them, not to the story built around them. Tom Bennett no longer drives to the police station on Mondays. He still keeps a candle in the window every October, though now it burns for a different reason. Detective Priya Okafor, the woman whose habit of reading a file twice cracked open a case that had gone cold for over a decade, still keeps Claire Bennett's original 2003 file in her office. Not as an open case anymore, but as a reminder, she says, of what it costs to stop asking questions too soon. Claire has since returned, slowly and on her own terms, to teaching. Not kindergarten anymore, but adult literacy classes at a community center 2 towns over, working with people who, she says, understand something about starting again that most people never have to learn. The town of Cedar Falls, for its part, has had to reckon with its own quiet failures in the years since Claire's return. The interviews that went unasked in 2003, the vendor list that sat forgotten in a storage unit for a decade, the small, human oversights that, stacked together, gave a patient man 15 years he never should have had. Detective Halloran, well into retirement now, still speaks to criminal justice students at the county college twice a year, using Claire's case not as a triumph but as a caution, a reminder, he tells them, that the coldest cases are rarely solved by a single brilliant insight, but by someone willing to read the same file one more time than anyone thought necessary. Beth Ann Cooper's family, in the neighboring county, watched Claire's rescue with an ache the Bennetts understood better than almost anyone alive. Investigators have reopened her case in full, and while no definitive connection to Tobias Kessler has yet been confirmed beyond the geographic and procedural similarities, her mother has said, publicly, that Claire's homecoming gave her a kind of hope she'd stopped allowing herself to feel. The search for Beth Ann continues. Claire herself has spoken only once, publicly, about the man who took her. Not with the fury many expected, nor with forgiveness, but with something quieter and harder to name. He spent 30 years building a version of me that never existed, she said. I'm not interested in understanding him. I'm interested in the 15 years I still have left, and everyone in them who never stopped believing I'd come back to have them. Sometimes, she told the one reporter she agreed to speak with, she still walks down to Miller's Lake at dusk when the light turns the water the same gold it was on the night she disappeared, and she lets herself feel, for a few minutes, both everything she lost and everything she somehow, impossibly, got back. Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply waits for someone willing to keep looking. Thank you for watching. If this case fascinated you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more incredible crime and mystery stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never stop asking questions.